At 5:42 in the morning, on a stretch of broken farmland northeast of Kharkiv city, a Russian assault group dismounts from two motorcycles and a stripped-down infantry mobility vehicle. They have less than 400 meters of dead ground to cross. They will not make it. Inside the next 11 minutes, 3 Ukrainian first-person view drones, 2 Mavic reconnaissance birds, and a single 120mm mortar team will turn that field into a ledger entry. Not a battle, a ledger entry. And that small, almost anonymous ledger entry, repeated dozens of times a day along the Kharkiv axis, is the truest picture of what is happening on this front right now. This is not a story about Kharkiv. This is a story about what happens when an army that still thinks in terms of mass, momentum, and Soviet-era arithmetic collides with an army that has rebuilt itself around precision, sensors, and economy of force. What you are witnessing is not a heavy battle in the romantic sense, not great columns of armor sweeping across the steppe. What you are witnessing is the industrial-scale erosion of Russian infantry by a defensive system that has finally caught up to 21st century warfare, and Russia is losing soldiers faster than its own recruitment offices can replace them. Let that sink in for a moment. The Russian Ministry of Defense, according to figures cross-referenced by the Institute for the Study of War and Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, signed roughly 70,500 new military contracts in the entire first quarter of 2026. That is well below the monthly quota Moscow needs simply to stand still. In the first 19 days of May, by the count of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Major Robert Brovdy, Ukrainian drones alone struck more than 19,000 Russian personnel. Drones alone, not artillery, not mines, not frontline rifle fire. The forecast for the full month is over 34,000 Russian casualties from drone strikes, and Fedorov has now publicly set a new monthly target of 50,000. The Russian army is not running out of soldiers tomorrow, but it is running out of soldiers faster than it can manufacture them, and the place where that mathematics is most visible right now is the Kharkiv direction. Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened on May 23rd, but why this particular battle was always going to look like this. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Pull the lens back. Rewind to the spring of 2024. That is when Russia opened the northern Kharkiv front, pushing across the international border around Vovchansk and Lipsy with several reinforced battalions. The assumption inside the Russian General Staff was straightforward and, on paper, defensible. Ukraine, they believed, was overextended. Kharkiv city was within tube artillery range if Russian forces could close the distance. A new buffer zone in northern Kharkiv Oblast would relieve pressure on Belgorod, force Ukrainian reserves north, and weaken the defense of Donetsk. The plan rested on 3 assumptions. First, that Ukrainian fortifications in the border belt were thin. Second, that Russian mass would overwhelm sensor coverage faster than Ukraine could thicken it. Third, that taking ground, even rubble, would translate into political pressure. Every one of those assumptions has now failed, and the failure is documented in the daily assessments coming out of Kyiv, Washington, and the open-source intelligence community. Vovchansk today is not a city. It is a debris field. Russian forces hold most of what remains of it, but what remains of it is rubble through which Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups infiltrate in 2s and 3s, often through cellars and storm drains, because anything larger than a 3-man team is detected and killed before it covers 50 meters of open ground. Lipsy has not fallen. The Russian advance toward Kharkiv city itself, the goal that justified the entire 2024 offensive, has stalled to the point where ISW reported on May 20th that Russian forces continued offensive operations northeast of Kharkiv city, but did not advance. 2 years into an offensive whose entire political logic depended on advancing. This matters enormously. And it gets even more serious from here. Now move east to the Oskil River line and the city of Kupiansk. Through the autumn of 2025, Russian mill bloggers and the Russian Ministry of Defense were claiming, almost weekly, that the encirclement of Kupiansk was imminent. By January 2026, they were claiming Kupiansk was effectively under Russian control. On May 16th, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Army General Valery Gerasimov, publicly told Vladimir Putin that Russian forces had seized the town of Borova. 4 days later, ISW had already documented that Borova remained firmly in Ukrainian hands and that Russian forces were still attempting infiltration assaults toward it from Borivka, Andriivka, and Zeleny High. The Russian chief of the general staff lied to the Russian president on camera about a town his army had not taken. That is not a propaganda incident. That is a command and control failure. What happened in Kupiansk itself is even more revealing. Beginning in November 2025 and accelerating through the winter, Ukrainian forces conducted a series of clearing operations inside the town. On May 19th, a Ukrainian company commander operating in the Kupiansk direction reported that Ukrainian troops had killed or captured the last remaining Russian sabotage and reconnaissance elements inside the city. ISW has since adjusted its control of terrain map to depict Kupiansk as the subject of Ukrainian counterattacks rather than Russian infiltration. And then comes the detail that tells you everything about the state of the Russian army on the Kharkiv axis. According to a source reporting on the Russian Western grouping of forces, the Russian command is now transferring elements of the 272nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, the 26th Tank Regiment, and the 153rd Tank Regiment, all subordinate to the 47th Tank Division of the 1st Guards Tank Army, the Moscow Military District's premier armored formation, away from the Kupiansk direction and into the Lyman direction to compensate for heavy losses. The 1st Guards Tank Army, the unit that, in Soviet doctrine, was meant to spearhead the breakthrough into Western Europe. It is now being shuffled between sectors of an eastern Ukrainian city to plug holes. This is the moment to pause and define what we are actually looking at, because mainstream framing keeps missing it. Mainstream framing treats the Kharkiv axis as a kind of grinding stalemate. Two armies locked together, exchanging fire, neither side moving. That framing is wrong. A stalemate is two opponents in roughly equivalent condition exhausting each other. What is happening on the Kharkiv axis is asymmetric attrition. One side is taking 3 to 5 times the casualties of the other on terrain it is failing to take, against a defender whose sensor and strike loop is tightening every single week. That is not stalemate. That is one army being slowly dismantled in place while the other learns faster. The hidden military variable, the one the news cycle keeps refusing to put at the center of the story, is the drone kill chain. Let me be specific. In May 2026, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces became the single largest direct producer of Russian casualties on the battlefield. Not artillery, not infantry rifle fire, not mines, drones. The implication of that is doctrinally enormous. For 100 years, the dominant casualty producer in land warfare was indirect fire, primarily artillery. That has now changed in this war, in this sector, in this month, and the consequences ripple outward. If your casualty producer is artillery, you need a vast logistical tail, ammunition factories, rail lines, shell depots, and trained gun crews. If your casualty producer is a $4,000 FPV drone built in a Kyiv basement and flown by a 22-year-old operator in a forward dugout, your logistical tail shrinks by an order of magnitude, and your tactical responsiveness expands by an order of magnitude. That is not a technological adjustment. That is a doctrinal earthquake, and the Russian army has not yet absorbed it. You can see the failure to absorb it in the way Russian forces are still attacking northeast of Kharkiv city. They are using small infiltration groups, often on motorcycles, sometimes on buggies and ATVs, because mechanized columns no longer survive contact with Ukrainian drone coverage. ISW has documented this pattern through April and May. Small groups dispersed, fast-moving. That is a rational adaptation to the drone environment, and it tells you the tactical command at battalion level has learned, but the doctrinal command above them has not, because the operational goal remains the same as it was in 2024, push toward Kharkiv city and create a buffer zone, while the means available to achieve that goal have been reduced from combined arms breakthrough to motorcycle infiltration. You cannot take a city of 1 million people with motorcycles. You cannot even take a village of 1,000 people with motorcycles when every motorcycle is being tracked by a Mavic and serviced by an FPV strike within 90 seconds of detection. So why are they still attacking? The first mistake was not tactical, it was psychological. Vladimir Putin has staked the political legitimacy of this war on the seizure of named places: Vovchansk, Kupiansk, Borova, Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka. He needs his generals to deliver named places to him, and his generals have learned that lying about it is safer than admitting it cannot be done with the resources provided. That is why Gerasimov told him Borova had fallen when it had not. That is why Russian infiltrators inside Kupiansk are raising flags on rooftops for the cameras and then being killed before sundown. ISW described this on May 20th as a cognitive warfare effort designed to aggrandize Russian advances and falsely portray the front line as collapsing across the theater, contrary to all available evidence. The flag raisings are not military operations. They are content production for Kremlin television, and the soldiers carrying those flags are dying for footage. This is the prosecutorial heart of the case. The Russian army is now being instructed to take ground it cannot hold, with formations that cannot survive contact in order to produce media product that domestic audiences cannot independently verify. Every link in that chain is a structural failure. The political layer has imposed objectives the operational layer cannot meet. The operational layer has imposed lies the tactical layer must die to maintain, and the tactical layer is hemorrhaging the recruitment base on which the entire system depends. Pull the lens back further. The industrial and state-level consequences of what is happening in Kharkiv are already visible in Moscow's order of battle, in its economy, and in its diplomacy. Begin with order of battle. The Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service estimated in February 2026 that approximately 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since February 2022. ISW's May 16th assessment recorded that Russian forces suffered roughly 160,000 casualties in a single recent operational period. The Economist, citing intelligence assessments earlier this spring, put the running monthly Russian loss rate at roughly 35,000 soldiers, a figure that, as we noted at the top, exceeds Russia's contract recruitment rate. And in April 2026, Russia recorded a net loss of territory in Ukraine for the first time since August 2024. Read that sentence again. For the first time in 20 months, the line moved the other way. Not because Ukraine launched a grand offensive, because Ukrainian counterattacks in western Zaporizhia, in Kupiansk, in Mala Tokmachka, and Bilohirya are nibbling back ground that Russia spent thousands of lives to take. Now apply that math to industry. The Russian state cannot replace what it is losing because it cannot recruit fast enough, cannot manufacture armor fast enough, and cannot generate the operational reserves needed for breakthrough operations. The 47th Tank Division being asked to plug holes between Kupiansk and Lyman is the order of battle equivalent of a sovereign defaulting on its short-term debt. You are spending your strategic capital to cover tactical shortfalls. That is not how winning armies behave. Now apply it to diplomacy. On May 20th, Vladimir Putin sat in Beijing across from Xi Jinping. The headline objective of that visit, according to Putin's own presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, was to secure a signed agreement on the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline, a project Russia has been pushing since at least 2024 to substitute for the European energy income it lost when it invaded Ukraine. Xi did not sign. 40 smaller agreements were signed. The pipeline was not. Why does that matter on a video about Kharkiv? Because the political pressure on Putin to deliver named cities to his domestic audience is partially a function of his shrinking economic options abroad. If Beijing will not bail him out on energy, Moscow has fewer cards to play. The man who cannot get Xi to sign a pipeline deal is the same man telling Gerasimov to take Borova, and Gerasimov is the same man telling battalion commanders to throw motorcycle assaults into Ukrainian drone coverage. The chain runs all the way up. Strategic isolation produces operational desperation, produces tactical waste. And it gets even more serious from here. Let me bring you to the climactic operational picture, because this is where Ukraine has shifted the logic of the war in the last 6 weeks. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky, in an interview with Militarny, published in mid-May, stated that the number of Ukrainian offensive actions had begun to exceed the number of Russian offensive actions as of May 14th. That is not a single counteroffensive in the 2023 sense. That is a distributed seizing of tactical initiative across the entire theater. In western Zaporizhia, Ukrainian forces have liberated Mala Tokmachka and Bilohirya and are pushing east of Plavny along the E-105 highway. In southern Donetsk, Ukrainian forces have advanced into central Ilinivka and are holding positions in western Kostiantynivka, contrary to Russian claims. In Sumy, Ukrainian frontline strikes are degrading Russian drone control points inside Kursk Oblast. And in the Kharkiv direction itself, Russian forces continued offensive operations on May 20th and did not advance. The Kharkiv front is the canvas on which all of this is being painted, because it was supposed to be the easy one. Northern Kharkiv in 2024 was meant to be Russia's pressure release, the shortest supply line from Belgorod, the fastest path to forcing Ukrainian reserves north, the most politically useful target, given Kharkiv city's symbolic weight as Ukraine's second city. None of it has worked. Vovchansk is rubble that Russia holds only because Ukraine has chosen not to die clearing it. Lipsy has not fallen. Kharkiv city is no closer to tube artillery range than it was 18 months ago. The Russian forces fighting there are dying at a rate that exceeds the Russian state's ability to replace them, and they are dying for a buffer zone that is no longer geographically achievable with the means available. This is the broader lesson here, and it is the lesson every casual news consumer is missing. The story of May 23rd on the Kharkiv axis is not that there is a heavy battle. There is always a heavy battle. The story is that the heavy battle is now structurally one-sided. Russia is producing the casualties. Ukraine is producing the strikes. Russia is producing the lies to Moscow. Ukraine is producing the maps to Washington. And the gap between those two production lines is widening every week. The real question is what Moscow does next. The honest answer, based on the order of battle data, is that Moscow has three options and none of them are good. Option 1, escalate mobilization. That requires a politically costly second wave of conscription, which Putin has spent 2 years avoiding. Option 2, accept the attrition and continue to grind, hoping Western support to Ukraine collapses before Russian recruitment does. That is the current bet, and the math is moving against it. Option 3, negotiate from weakness while pretending it is strength. That requires Putin to publicly redefine what victory means, which is precisely what his Beijing visit was meant to set the stage for, and which Xi refused to underwrite. None of the three options recovers the strategic initiative on the Kharkiv axis. All three of them require the Russian soldier on the ground northeast of Kharkiv city to keep dying while the political class figures out which way to fail. History will record this period, the spring of 2026, as the moment the Russian theory of victory in Ukraine quietly broke. Not in a single battle. Not in a dramatic encirclement, in the Daily Ledger entry. In the motorcycle assault that does not make it 400 meters. In the company commander reporting that the last Russian saboteur in Kupiansk has been killed. In the chief of the general staff lying about Borova. In the 1st Guards Tank Army being parceled out to plug holes. In Xi declining to sign the pipeline. In the recruitment offices missing their quotas for a 5th consecutive month. None of those individual facts is a headline. All of them together are the verdict. What happens next changes everything. If Ukraine can sustain its mid-range strike campaign through the summer, if drone production continues to outpace Russian counter-drone adaptation, and if Western air defense and long-range fire support holds, then the Kharkiv axis will not just hold. It will become the template by which the rest of the front is rolled back. If any of those three conditions slip, the math becomes harder, and the Russian theory of victory gets one more season to prove itself. That is the open question. It will be answered on the ground day by day, ledger entry by ledger entry, between now and the end of summer. I will be tracking every meaningful development on this front, and on the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and long-range strike fronts that connect to it in the updates ahead. If you want to stay strategically ahead of the casual news cycle, if you want to see the war as a system rather than as a series of disconnected explosions, subscribe to the channel. We are building toward a viewership that takes this conflict as seriously as the people fighting it do, and every subscriber moves us closer to that goal. Stay with me because the questions raised by May 23rd on the Kharkiv axis do not have simple answers, and the next several weeks are going to define how the rest of this war is fought.